Bitcoin for me was a nudge to question my deeper assumptions because everything that I'd been taught about money, we need inflation, this is just how things work. You start to question that, and Bitcoiners are primed to start asking deeper questions about, if I go internally, what assumptions do I have about myself, the nature of reality, my connection to the earth and to other human beings? What if I go really deep into that? And my experience is that that rabbit hole is deeper and the paradigm shifts are much more crazy, actually. So I'm quite optimistic that on a Bitcoin standard, this will free up more time for more people and allow people to step into higher states of consciousness and connect to where you're operating from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity. And that changes everything, in my opinion.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Matt Manning to the podcast. Matt is the founder of the Liminal Leap and exploring personal and collective evolution with Bitcoin, AI, decentralization, wisdom, consciousness, and awakening. I recently met Matt on a Spaces that we did on spirituality and Bitcoin, and I really wanted to explore more with him. So welcome to Bitcoin Age, Matt.
Thank you for having me, Paula. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Yes, me too. You have some really deep tweets on X. And before we get there, your pinned tweet is that you just left a job to step into the unknown. Not because you had to, but because something deeper was calling. Tell us about that.
Sure. Bitcoin actually fits into that. Bitcoin for me, I got into it a number of years ago. 2018 was my first, buy where I put some tax return money into it. And, it was always a way to get rich and make more money and have a speculative investment. It's done all of those things on some level for me. But I realized that Bitcoin was such a paradigm shift in the way I viewed money, everything I'd been taught about money, the system that we live in. And it was such a shift that it caused me to question everything. And I say that Bitcoin was kind of the gateway to a spiritual awakening for me. And so over the last couple of years, that has accelerated, and I've been feeling a pull. I worked in sales for 17 years, most recently doing enterprise software sales. So it's a wonderful company, making good money, selling to some of the largest companies in the world. But as I really started to go deep within myself, that felt quite empty and unfulfilling to just be focused on more money and buying more things. And so I felt a pull to psychology, consciousness. I studied psychology in college, and I thought it would be a couple years out before I made the move, but life kind of pulled me in that direction. And yeah, about 6 weeks ago, I quit my job to dedicate my time to consciousness. And I think Bitcoin fits into that. Bitcoiners are uniquely positioned to see a paradigm shift and start to question everything within themselves.
Yeah, we'll dive more into that. But tell us more about your Bitcoin journey. What was it that really made you realize something wasn't right in the system?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember being at the office in the bull run of 2017, 2018. And I saw, I was in a big tech company, open floor plan, and all the sales reps were making tons of money and then losing tons of money. And I didn't quite understand what everyone was doing, but there was a lot of hype around Bitcoin. And then, I put some money in as a speculative investment, some tax return money. And I had a neighbor friend who was introducing me to it. So I bought some Bitcoin and I bought some Ethereum. I didn't know what I was doing. And then my personality is such that I want to understand things at a deep level. So once I kind of dabbled, I started to listen to a lot of different podcasts. And it was kind of challenging for the first year because there was so much noise. So I listened to a lot of podcasts that were crypto, all these tokens, and I couldn't understand even what they were talking about. It just sounded like a foreign language, and I couldn't connect the dots to like why this actually matters. But quickly I started to find the Bitcoiners, some of the Bitcoin podcasts and I realized, wow, these Bitcoiners are talking about some of the biggest issues in the world. They're talking about the very bones of the system, first principles thinking, incentives, energy, politics, geopolitics. I mean, they're going into the biggest problems in the whole world. And so I quickly, after about a year, kind of gravitated toward the Bitcoiners, wasn't so convinced on all the other stuff. And then COVID happened, and I really went down the rabbit hole during 2020. And that's when the big shift, I started to connect a lot of dots, listening to people like Jeff Booth, Preston Pish, Michael Saylor, a number of others. But I was working from home, and basically while I was working, I would listen to as much Bitcoin content as I could. And my whole worldview started to shift. And that's when I started to question everything. And little did I know that, Bitcoin was just the beginning of a pretty big shift to my own identity.
Yeah, it sure is. I've read in the Liminal Leap, you have some amazing articles, and you wrote about that your body was telling you that something wasn't right. How did that play a role in you quitting your job, and a well-paying job at that, and focusing on consciousness and life?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. Over the years, I've always struggled with kind of anxiety, and my body's had a lot of tension for a really long time. I've got 3 young kids. One of them is pretty severely special needs. So my system got quite overwhelmed, and I feel things pretty deeply. So I think I got to a point where my whole nervous system was so overwhelmed that something had to change, and I was willing to go deep within myself. And as I went through a pretty intense awakening, and all the repressed emotions that are stored in the body started to come out, and I started to process a lot of that and realize how much wisdom and trauma and different things are held in the body itself. And it's not just the brain that has intelligence. We can tap into the body's wisdom, into the wisdom of our own heart. But, as I tuned in more to my body and started to realize, that's part of what I started listening to, is like, I'm here at work, and sure, I need to make money, but like, at some point, when can I just tap into what my soul really wants to do, and what my purpose is? And so I thought I would make a move in a couple of years. I knew I would get out of kind of the corporate world. I'd been filling a poll into psychology and consciousness, and I decided to approach my employer and tell them, look, they had seen I had been changing a lot. There was some big identity shifts going on, and quite honestly, it was pretty volatile as all that stuff comes out. But I approached them and said, hey, I'm going to make a shift into this new type of career in a couple of years. There might be some internal positions that are better fit for me, where I can feel more purpose, that are more people focused. So there was a couple of jobs that I thought were going to work out, and then for whatever reason they didn't. And my boss told me, like, we need you all in on sales for the next 2 years. The company's probably going to be acquired, maybe in that type of a time. And so he said, write down what you being all in looks like. And so I wrote a letter saying, hey, I'm all in for the next 18, 24 months. This was about 6 weeks ago. And then I woke up in the middle of the night at about 1:30 a.m. and I couldn't breathe. Like, I was suffocated. And in that moment, I knew that, like, my body was telling me it was time. And so I went in and quit my job on Monday. That was a Friday night, and I quit on Monday, and I'm kind of trusting that something's coming together. But it's really scary. But yeah, I think the body was telling me that it knew something. And I'm really trusting that my heart and my body are tuned into something deeper, and we can opt out of the systems that we think we need.
I love that. I had a very similar journey, but I started my personal journey more on the health side. So I was
Mm.
into holistic health for more than 20 years, and I'm very good at listening to my body, but I don't listen well to my emotions, but I listen to my body. And I know the body doesn't lie. The body can't lie. It's just, bones and muscles, and it doesn't lie. But humans sometimes lie, but the body doesn't lie. I also wanted to quit my job because of similar reasons. And I took the whole year, most of last year, off. And now I've slowly eased back into it. but deep down I know that where I have to go. But you mentioned that we still need to make money. So I know some people are in the phase of still making money, but wanting to move to something that more aligns with their soul, like you have said. And the fiat system often forces us into doing work or jobs that, I don't know if I want to say force. The fiat system often directs us into work just to keep up because we have to make enough to survive and retire one day. Whereas Bitcoin, now that we have sound money, we have another way to think about things.
Exactly. You know, I'm interested in Bitcoin for its monetary principles, and I think they're based on sound principles that reward savers and people that can store their hard-earned energy in something that's going to accrue in value instead of just melting away. So I'm interested in that. What I'm more interested in is what Bitcoin enables for humanity, and I'm just going off of my own experience. After 2020, I decided to go pretty heavily into Bitcoin. And I thought it would be another cycle before I made the leap into something else. But Bitcoin is part of the reason that I'm able to do something like this, to have enough to where I can, quit my job and try to build something out, as scary as that is. But I think that, in as much as Bitcoin frees time for people, that allows people to have the time and energy to go deep into those soul searching questions and really tune into what their body and their heart and the wisdom of their own soul is telling them. But to your point, in the existing fiat system, especially, I have 3 young kids, and it's striking how expensive it is just to feed a family. So the majority of people are just stuck in survival mode, and they have to go do whatever they have to do to provide for their family and to meet the basic needs that they have. So I'm quite optimistic that on a Bitcoin standard, this will free up more time for more people and allow people to step into higher states of consciousness and connect to where you're operating from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity. And that changes everything, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. You wrote that Bitcoin isn't just technology, it's a spiritual nudge, a silent invitation to exit the illusion and re-enter alignment. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, something that's been important to me is the study of modern developmental psychology. And I don't want to get too much into the theory. I'm kind of a theory nerd, but the basic theory is that Ken Wilber has his integral theory, and there's a number of other, theories that go along with that. But the basic premise is that children develop. You start as an infant and you don't even have identification with me, with you're just receiving, purely receiving, and you're one with everything. Then early on in that development, the self comes in, the ego, you develop, hey, there's me and there's someone else. And that ego is what's driving everything up through a number of different developmental stages. At the modern research is showing that adults continue to develop just like children do and adolescents do. Unfortunately, many adults get stuck and don't continue to develop into higher states or stages of consciousness. And so these consciousness stages, at higher levels of development, you start to see that everything's socially constructed, and you start to operate not from the ego but from awareness itself, and words start to drop away. I think Bitcoin as a protocol is, at least in my experience, and some people experience it the other way, they do all the deep soul searching stuff and then find Bitcoin later. I don't think there's one way that it works, but Bitcoin for me was a nudge to question my deeper assumptions, because everything that I'd been taught about money, we need inflation, this is just how things work. You start to question that. And for me, that's Bitcoiners are primed to start asking deeper questions about, if I go internally, what assumptions do I have about myself, the nature of reality, my connection to the earth and to other human beings? What if I go really deep into that and My experience is that that rabbit hole is deeper, and the paradigm shifts are much more crazy, actually, because the very nature of how you experience reality moment to moment can change. And that's beautiful. I think we need more of that. As much as I love Bitcoin and I'm optimistic about what Bitcoin brings to humanity, we also need more people to upgrade their own operating system internally, to not be driven by ego and to be driven by love and compassion and abundance, especially our leaders, because leaders that are driven by ego and not love and compassion, even with systems like Bitcoin, that can be scary. So I think Bitcoin is a way that it frees up more time for people to do this deep sort of work, and I'm optimistic about what that will do for humanity.
Do you think that people who go on the Bitcoin journey and down the rabbit hole, who truly go on that journey, have a little bit of a ego awakening? Like Jeff Booth says, he called his company Ego Death for that reason. It's a funny journey because we don't want to be doormats, but at the same time, we don't want our ego stopping us from seeing something that is better than what we've done before.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I think on a lot of levels, Bitcoin is an ego test. Um, are you willing to question every assumption you have and say, maybe I'm wrong? Maybe everything that I've been taught about the nature of the system, and that we've built systems, jobs, financial systems around. Am I willing to admit that maybe I was wrong about that and that there's a whole new way of viewing things? In my opinion, that was just the warm up for a deeper ego test, and realizing that there's other deep things, that paradigm shifts to the nature of reality. And, when it comes to ego death, it's my experience that the ego, at higher levels of development, the ego is no longer in the driver's seat. It never fully disappears. But as you really go deep within yourself, you start to notice when the ego is coming in and driving. And the ego is always, it's very much connected to the mind. It's like this or that. It's me or versus somebody else. It's binary. It's ones and zeros. And as you get into a higher state of consciousness and awareness, that's just no longer the case. You start to see that we're all interconnected. There's no difference between me and you. There's no separation, and you can experience everything as one. That's what all the great wisdom teachers and wisdom traditions have been pointing to. And it's actually like, I'm a Christian and I'm a fan of Jesus. I actually think that, like, Jesus's message itself, we get it wrong. And what he was saying is, you need to die to who you thought you were and upgrade yourself to not be operating from the ego. You come with an egoic operating system into life, and it's time to upgrade that software to a higher state that's not driven by the ego. It's driven by awareness itself. And so Bitcoiners are uniquely positioned, I think, to question that. But in my opinion, it's more disorienting to go deep within yourself than even, the system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get back to that. But you did mention political leaders. And I wanted to ask you because, yes, at the moment in the US, we are getting a strategic reserve. We don't know how much. The government is working on reducing expenses and a lot of positive things possibly happening fiscally for the US. Do you believe that the government can adopt a Bitcoin standard, or not even a Bitcoin standard? How do you think this goes as far as we live in a fiat debt based system, and Bitcoin is exactly the opposite to that? Can it happen for the US?
Yeah, I mean, there's in my opinion, there's so many different possibilities for how that plays out. My thesis for a long time, mostly influenced by Jeff Booth, is that Bitcoin is a forcing function, and the incentives align to where I think everyone will have to adopt a Bitcoin standard. Like, I'm convinced Bitcoin is up there with the printing press, the combustible engine, the internet, antibiotics. Like, it's that big. And I think we're barely scratching the surface on the implications. The transition, however, from the existing fiat debt based system to a Bitcoin standard is inherently challenging And it's going to break a lot of things down. It's going to be painful to make that type of shift. I equate it to upshifting into a higher state of consciousness. I'm just kind of, comparing that to my own experience. Like upshifting to a higher state of consciousness is so disorienting. Everything that you've built internally has to fall away. The systems that you relied upon, not to say they were bad. So, I think the fiat system has served a purpose. We needed it to progress through the Industrial Revolution. However, at some point, the old system doesn't work anymore. So can the US and other countries adopt a Bitcoin standard? Yes, and I think they're going to have to. Based on human nature, greed, ego, I think they're going to try to influence the system and like, do things that they've done in the existing banking system to Bitcoin. And I'm sure there will be failures in that as people realize that you can't stop the train, and the incentives just align for countries and everybody to adopt Bitcoin, or else you suffer. So I don't know if that really answers your questions, because the how, I don't spend too much time thinking about the how. I think we need to get more people educated on a Bitcoin standard and building solutions to be able to make the transition. But I think it happens one way or the other. But I'm more of a macro thinker. So
Yeah, maybe it happens one person at a time and slowly. One of your tweets, you mentioned that society is running legacy consciousness software when it comes to money and Bitcoin. And that's part of the problem, right?
exactly. Yeah. I compare it to, in Bitcoin, people run a full node to verify on their own what consensus is showing on the system, and they're not outsourcing that to somebody else. You can plug into the network and verify for yourself. So, in my mind, it feels like a lot of people need to run their own full node internally and tap into their own consciousness instead of outsourcing their consciousness to a system that tells them what to believe. Um, Run your own node internally with your own inner discernment, and you can download, your own wisdom, and not just download whatever the culture tells you need to do.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So, how do you upshift to a higher consciousness? How do you do that in your personal life?
The more I've learned about consciousness and these developmental levels, the more I've learned that, there's a building block. Like all of those stages of consciousness that children go through need to develop out. And all of those levels still exist within us, right? So my experience has been that going down into the roots and maturing the baseline features, because as I've really gone deep within myself, I realized that there were certain things from my childhood, from the way I was conditioned in society and in a specific culture. I live in Utah. I grew up, I'm a Mormon. So that was a very specific kind of way to view the world. And it programmed certain things within me. So as you go down deep into the roots and become more mature at the base level, it's almost like a Jenga tower. If you've got something down lower that's flimsy, it causes like things to start moving up at the top. So if you can go and solidify the base and get your roots a little bit deeper, it's kind of like a tree. Like as you go deeper within yourself, the roots start to sprout up. So my teacher says that the way down is the way up. So I've come to trust that it's a fairly natural process. Like humans want to evolve, but a lot of times there's things that we have to, and that's what's uncomfortable about the deep interpersonal shifts, is you got to be willing to go deep within that. And the ego and the nervous system view those things as safety. That's how it's always been. So to shift those things is scary. But as you go deeper within them, it helps. But other things that I've done has been meditation. Around the same time that I got into Bitcoin, actually, I started to meditate here and there, and have done that on and off for 7 years. But the last couple of years, I've dedicated more time to a meditative practice. And my experience is that we're in a world that's so overstimulated. There's so much input, and I don't know that our nervous systems and bodies are wired for the way we live in modern living. There's so much information. And so coming to stillness and not being constantly distracted with the next dopamine hit allows you to come to stillness. And a lot of times that's challenging because the deep rooted stuff that we distract from feeling starts to bubble up. And so coming to stillness regularly and observing myself and getting comfortable, like sitting in discomfort, has really helped me to upshift the consciousness as well.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. I have noticed that when I have gone back to look at the past and it's uncomfortable, I know it's going to be uncomfortable for a short period of time, but once I deal with it, accept it, because I cannot change the past, right?
Right.
Then I can heal and move forward. And yeah, I do think that's similar to the Bitcoin journey. We realize that we've been listening to and believing a system that is now actually based on theft. And
Right.
also, yeah, inflation is stealing from us. Like you said, it had a place at one time, but it has continued to deteriorate as maybe people get greedy or since we went off the gold standard. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's only one way the existing system ends. And, we just continue to ramp it up and leverage it. And there's only one way it ends. So, and that ending, if we don't have something built out to transition to, that's actually quite scary. But, with everything that's going on, as you fit in all those developmental models that I was talking about for personal development, as you step back and look at the world collectively, you see that society, the world, communities go through those same developmental levels on a community level. And so you start to see where Bitcoin fits in and why something like Bitcoin would have to emerge for the collective consciousness to upshift. And I wrote another article about how volatility is a feature, not a bug. And I compare that, like, Bitcoin is inherently volatile. It goes up and down. Sometimes it breaks out to a new level that it's never been to, and then it'll crash back down to find its equilibrium, and then it'll go back up and stabilize in that higher level. And that's the same way that humans develop internally, individually, and collectively. Um, there's volatility as you grow. You can't just emerge into something new in a straight line. And so that's where I realized, as I saw my own personal development and how volatile that was, and learn to lean into it, and then overlay that with how Bitcoin's being monetized and starting to trust this natural rhythm and this process that plays out, that there's nothing wrong with it. And as we open up to it, and instead of trying to distract ourselves from the challenges and the volatility in our own lives, leaning into that and having conviction that it's part of a process, Bitcoin's helped me to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As you were sharing that, I was thinking the more I understand Bitcoin, the more I can handle the volatility. But I didn't really think about it as volatility in my spiritual growth. And I can see that me and much of society tends to want to run away from that, maybe because that's not a priority. But what else are we here to do, right? Other than grow spiritually.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So, what else has Bitcoin taught you about yourself? How has Bitcoin changed you?
Let's see. Um, it's helped me to really think about the value of my time is a big thing. So as you step back and start to think through, just switching my unit of account to Bitcoin has shifted so many things. But I think it's made me much more conscious about what I'm doing, how I'm spending my time, how am I engaging with my kids, and realizing that, there's only a certain amount of time that I get to spend with them. Do I want to spend it at the office all day long, just grinding to, buy more things that society tells me I need to keep up with the neighbors? No, I want to have deep relationships that mean something, and Bitcoin has shifted that relationship. Yeah, I can't explain how much Bitcoin has shifted for me on a personal level, because everything changed once I understood Bitcoin. My life took off in a way that I wasn't expecting, and it continues to surprise me.
Yeah, that's funny. Low time preference was my very next question.
Mm.
Are your family on board with your Bitcoin way of life, and how do you bring them in on that?
Yeah, my family. I mean, I'm like most Bitcoiners. I've talked a lot about Bitcoin at the dinner table with the extended family, with my neighbors, with everybody. At some point, I'm sure they're like, "Matt, shut up about Bitcoin." Yeah, it's really annoying. But no, my wife, she kind of trusts me, and so she knows enough about Bitcoin. I've talked to her a lot about it. But she has a lot to do with our kids. She spends a lot of time there, and so she hasn't totally gone down the rabbit hole, but she trusts me enough to say, "Hey, I trust you." And I think she's seen the changes that Bitcoin have brought, not just financially, but on all the other levels that we've been talking about. But I'm starting to see that more and more people over time, as you're talking about Bitcoin, something I've learned is that a lot of times early on, especially in my Bitcoin journey, I would really try to convince people about Bitcoin. And I had this chip on my shoulder. And as I look back on it, a lot of that was driven by ego, where it's like, I wanted to feel right. And let me show you why I'm right about this. Cause I do think Bitcoiners are right about a lot of things. But if the reason that we're talking to somebody about Bitcoin is driven by our own ego to be right, then it's not as effective. And I've realized that people are ready for Bitcoin when they're ready. And it's interesting, over the last couple of years, I'll have people that I talked to about it 2, 3 years ago. We had a conversation, and all of a sudden their life experience leads them to start to make those questions, and then they call, and I'm able to talk with them. So that's more what I do now, as opposed to, I was always trying to get the Bitcoin comment in and tie it in. And I think people could see through how I just wanted to be right. So I think letting people understand it on their own time frame, and also sharing when they're ready, and not being driven by the need to be right or to convince anybody.
I love that you brought that up. I I have thought about that a lot. How much the world is based on wanting to be right, whether it's right about the religion or right about their political party or right about just being right because it gives you a little boost to your ego. And
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with being right, but I agree. I no longer try to convince people because, yeah, nobody really wants to be convinced. It's like we say in Bitcoin, you get it when you're ready for it.
Exactly. And tying that into consciousness and these developmental levels that I'm talking about, at the lower end of the spectrum, it's all driven by this or that. There's one thing right. It's binary. It's one or the other. And my experience has taught me that many times there isn't a right or a wrong. There's wisdom in all of the different perspectives. And I certainly have my bias in what I think is more valuable, but I can step back and detach from what I think and try to see somebody else's perspective. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, even at the level of government, if our leaders are so driven by us versus them being right, versus, one country versus another, it's a very natural thing. And it's just an embodiment of that developmental level that humanity's in. So until we get more mature leaders who can step back and see everybody's perspective and not be driven just by me being right, and us stepping back and realizing that we're all one humanity, we're all part of this same organism, and we change from like us versus them to what perspective does everybody have that's valuable, and how can we all win? We don't have to limit to one winner and one loser. And I think Bitcoin enables the world to be able to shift more to that. I mean, that's a complicated question, and I think over time we will evolve to that. But I think Bitcoin in the next 10 to 15 years, if we get it right, can set the world up for something so good we can barely even comprehend it. But it also has the ability to like absolutely destroy humanity if all the decisions are being driven by ego, with technology and nuclear, all the interconnectedness. Yeah, there's high potential each way. I think we're at a critical junction point, and I think doing your own inner work has ripple effects out into the world. And so start with yourself, and I think we can create a much better place.
Why do you think that Bitcoin could destroy the world? It is decentralized right now. It's never been hacked. How would we get to the point where it could lead to destroying the world.
Yeah, I guess when I say that we have potential for destruction, I'm not talking about Bitcoin specifically. I think, the point in time that we find ourselves in humanity, if we get things right and some of the old systems, we can replace them in an intelligent way and get more mature leaders who are thinking in the ways we've just been talking about, then we have the ability and potential to create abundance. And it doesn't fix everything. The world is inherently messy. Being human comes with all sorts of challenges. And like, I don't want to paint the picture. Sometimes I think Bitcoin fixes a lot of things and it's much better than the existing system. But when I'm saying that there's potential for destruction, I just think with, the fourth turning, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the book The Fourth Turning, but every 80 or so years there's a big power structure, geopolitics kind of shake up and old systems dissolve away. We're right in the middle of that. And I think the next 5 years are going to be inherently disorienting. And if certain leaders let their ego get in the way too much, and just with, the amount of kinetic power that exists in the world, we have a very real possibility of like destroying humanity through a big war. I hope that, cooler heads prevail. And that's why I'm passionate about upshifting consciousness to not be us versus them, this black versus white, but going deep within yourself, realizing that we're all connected. And I think we need a critical mass of people to upshift into more mature consciousness. Even within Bitcoin, I find myself, you can get on Bitcoin Twitter and like it's this cesspool of like going back and forth. And I think if we can upshift to being more concerned with our shared humanity, Bitcoin really has the potential to make a bigger impact.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. It comes back to time is our most valuable resource, because since we don't know how the world's going to turn out, in the meantime, the best thing we can do is do something valuable with our time and do what we love, which is what we started this out as saying, is you quit something that wasn't working for you to find a better way of life and find that balance to spend with your family too. And I've found that all the Bitcoiners I speak to are at least attempting this. You're right, there is some back and forth with still wanting to be right and a lot of focus on price, which
Mm.
is great.
Yeah.
But that's why I try to bring the focus back to the spiritual and how it can actually change the world. That's huge.
Right. Yeah, it's become the important thing to me. Again, I don't discredit. We need Bitcoin's price to continue to go up for it to be adopted and for more people to have eyes on it and to prove its value. And I think it will over a longer time period. I've been in Bitcoin long enough to know that, it can be really volatile over the short period. Yeah, to your point, I think the deeper implications, and I think we're just barely scratching the surface. Bitcoin is so nascent, and what it means for the next 100, 200 years. I think we're just barely scratching the surface. So it's really important work. And I'm really inspired by so many different Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners to me are some of the smartest, most critical thinkers. They're really willing to go deep into first principles thinking, and that generally speaking have more altruistic and deeper goals for what humanity can be, and a system that's more fair and open and transparent and built on principles that I think bring value to the world. So yeah, I love the Bitcoiners. The Bitcoin community has been amazing to me, and I have so many good friends, and I respect so many people that are in Bitcoin. I love what we do every day.
Do you have any meetups in your area?
There are some meetups, yeah. Just with my kids, it's hard for me to go in the evenings. But yeah, I've got a good group of Bitcoiners that I speak with. And I was much more into, going to the conferences and that sort of thing back 2020, 2021 or 2021. I went right after COVID and made some really good friendships. Maybe I'll start going back to those types of events. But yeah, the last couple of years has been more focused on the consciousness aspect, and that's really where I spend my time. And I think that the implications for consciousness are even bigger for the world, and Bitcoin is a huge part of that upshift.
You mentioned in one of your tweets conspiracy theory versus futurist is like a couple of years. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, a lot of the Bitcoiners, as I went down the rabbit hole, you start to, um, all the different things that Bitcoiners have been talking about for a long time with inflation, money printing, big pharma, the food system, these incentives that are actually just, the whole system is kind of designed to keep us unhealthy. So those types of takes that I've been talking about with family for a number of years, I just noticed this trend where that's like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. I've been called a conspiracy theorist a number of times over the years. And now I kind of look at the news and what's accepted generally within society. And those same topics a few years ago, people were being called conspiracy theorists. So, yeah, I've just started to learn that what is kind of taboo in a certain time period really quickly can become the norm in a couple of years. And I find that a lot of the things that Bitcoiners have been talking about since COVID 2021, 3 or 4 years now are kind of, they're the topics of conversation that I see in the community at work and that normal people are just talking about. And so Bitcoiners have a unique lens into, I think, thinking more critically about the future. That's what, certain personality types are drawn to Bitcoin. I think Bitcoiners are generally more visionary. They're more focused on the future and they see things a little bit differently. But it's been interesting to see that play out over time as, some of my ideas get called conspiracy and then the Overton window shifts and now it's just normal accepted information.
Yeah, it is interesting. How is AI going to affect us going forward?
Well, AI, that's part of the shift. Like, I really prescribe to Jeff Booth's theory that the existing monetary system is totally at odds with AI and the technological growth because the existing monetary system needs more debt, more consumption, more jobs, more everything just to stay afloat. And that's why everything gets more expensive and we mortgage our current state for for future productivity and every generation feels it more and more and more. And then here we have on the other side of this technology that's bringing prices down. I mean, AI, it blows my mind what I can do with it every single day that a few years ago I would have been like, no chance. And so, AI is taking jobs away, it's making things cheaper, it's making us more efficient. And so, those two things, like the monetary system needing more and more and more with this deflationary system and the deflationary nature of technology, they can't coexist together. So, that's where I'm talking about the old operating system, the plumbing of our existing financial system, centralized institutions, they can't keep up with the speed. They're just not built for the speed of technology. And so that's where I think we need to go really deep into the operating system. But I'm optimistic. Like, I've kind of embraced AI on a level. I used to be more scared about what to feed into it, and maybe some Bitcoiners that are really privacy focused probably would not agree with this, but I've kind of just embraced it, and I'm pretty liberal with how I use it. And I've found that it brings so much value. I tell it all sorts of things, and my therapist actually she about fell out of her chair one day because I came in and I asked AI from a psychological standpoint, what my most subtle blind spot is based on everything that it knows about me. And when I told her what it said, she was like, she was floored. She laughed for 5 minutes, about fell out of her chair, and she's like, I'm going to be out of a job because that thing nailed you. I mean, on a really subtle level. So, from a development perspective, it's really helped me to, I kind of use it as a therapist and I'm bouncing different ideas and interpersonal things, and asking it, what am I missing? And it's really helped to bring my development in. I think AI is going to rock our world. I don't think we're quite ready for what's coming in the next 5 or 10 years.
I agree. Yeah, I use it too, and it's very useful. And I'm choosing to look that it's going to be for a good force because embrace it or what? It's going ahead anyway.
Yeah, and that's where I would love. I've studied under a number of different meditation teachers who are very versed in Eastern kind of schools of wisdom, Buddhism and some of the Eastern schools, which have really enriched my life. And I think about this all the time. How can we create AI that's programmed to operate based on abundance and love and compassion and shared humanity, as opposed to the fiat system of me, more, 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 and driving consumers in a specific way. So I think AI has a ton of potential, but I think decentralized AI and AI that's programmed based on higher consciousness is going to be really important. We have a really good opportunity ahead of us to create something.
Maybe it's also like you said, it can be a mirror of us, because I
Mm.
find when I asked it about the spiritual side of Bitcoin, and it gave me a beautiful explanation. The more I put in, the better it got. I wanted to just ask you, so what's it like living on a Bitcoin standard? Are you measuring in sats now? Are you using Bitcoin as a store of value, or do you also use it as a medium of exchange?
Yeah, and I'm kind of figuring out with this job shift, how could I more fully embrace a Bitcoin standard? I've embraced a Bitcoin standard in that it's my unit of account. I think in terms of Bitcoin instead of dollars. I haven't fully embraced a Bitcoin standard where I'm just only using Bitcoin and using it as a medium of exchange. It's just been my store of value. And then I keep just enough dollars to pay my bills. I am intrigued though with how to fully embrace a Bitcoin standard. I know there's a number of people who have done it, but just changing my decisions to be calculated based on Bitcoin and measuring my own net worth in Bitcoin and making financial and investment decisions based on a Bitcoin unit of account and that assumption and knowing where Bitcoin goes over time has shifted everything about how I make decisions. Um, so yeah, I think I'm seeing more and more technology solutions being built for Bitcoiners to live on a Bitcoin standard. I think up to this point, it's still kind of been there's a lot of hoops to jump through, and for me, it's like I don't see why I would sell Bitcoin. But I think at some point you need to, and we need to create that circular economy. And we also need to detach. One thing I've learned on the spiritual path is attachment to anything is the root of suffering. And the attachment to money can also be something that we have to really evaluate. At what point is enough enough? And at what point do we need to use our resources in a way that really affects humanity as a whole? I think that will happen over time. But yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. I recently spoke to two people living fully on the Bitcoin standard. One was Max DeMarco, and the other one, Mark van Versendaal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
He,
watched some of that. That was a great
yeah,
interview.
yeah, he really talks about how your whole mindset shifts, but you don't know how it's going to shift until you actually do it. And I can see that being true, because then you've got to deal with the volatility. And you mentioned this, that some days aren't as easy as others. So maybe just go into that, to end. How do you deal with the days that aren't so easy, and maybe you question your decisions?
Yeah, it's a timely question because yesterday was actually one of those days for me. I think on a lot of levels, this whole quitting my job, betting on myself, trying to connect with my soul, it feels right. And I know that I'm trusting that something better can emerge. But on some levels, it's taking a step back because I had a great job. I had really good benefits. And so stepping into that is really scary. And some days I just am really relaxed about it. And then other days, my whole nervous system contracts. Yesterday was one of those days where, and really the last couple of weeks, I went on a meditation retreat a couple weeks back and spent 7 days in silence with a group of about 40 people. And I was really sensing into the rhythm. My nervous system kind of calmed down. And like last year when I did one of those retreats, I came back to real life and I was like calm for weeks and just, really kind of in this zen space. This year it was the total opposite because I came back from this really peaceful I got really still and quiet, and the mind settled down. And then I came back to life, and I'm like, whoa, I quit my job 5 weeks ago. What am I doing? And there was so much fear inside my system and my nervous system. Like, I almost wanted to puke a few times just because of the weight of everything. I know it's right, but it's really hard and challenging to step into the unknown, uncertainty that's really volatile. But I think Bitcoin has set me up to have a longer view and be able to stomach that day-to-day volatility. And I like to connect different ideas, and Bitcoin itself, I start to see the world through the lens of Bitcoin and through a shorter or a longer time preference, lowering the time preference and realizing that being human is inherently volatile. It's inherently scary. If you really open up to it, like, the reality of being human is so intense. It's so intense, and it makes sense why we choose to, you know, distract ourselves with drugs and alcohol or whatever that is to numb out how intense it is to be a human being. But I've realized that just like Bitcoin, we can embrace the volatility, we can embrace the good and the bad. And the more we're able to step into fear, the more we can actually trust and experience the good and the bad. And that's where I think the Buddhists are onto something about equanimity. Whatever comes, if we just accept it, we realize that our resistance to what's actually happening is actually what's causing the suffering, not the actual event itself.
So bring it on, universe. Yeah, I love that. It's more subtle than just drugs and alcohol. It can be TV, it can
Yep.
be
Yeah, totally.
shopping, it
Food.
can be keeping busy, right? There's just so many
Right. Yeah.
ways we do it.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, that's just a couple examples, but there are innumerable ways that we try to not experience the naked reality of being human and the intensity of this human experience. It's intense.
Yeah. Well, talking to you, I'm going to work on embracing it more. I really love your work on X and your newsletter blog and focusing Bitcoin and consciousness together. I just think it's wonderful. Thank you for joining me today, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I really enjoyed it. Bitcoin for me was a nudge to question my deeper assumptions, because everything that I'd been taught about money, we need inflation, this is just how things work. You start to question that, and Bitcoiners are primed to start asking deeper questions about, if I go internally, what assumptions do I have about myself, the nature of reality, my connection to the earth and to other human beings? What if I go really deep into that? And my experience is that that rabbit hole is deeper, and the paradigm shifts are much more crazy, actually. So I'm quite optimistic that on a Bitcoin standard, this will free up more time for more people and allow people to step into higher states of consciousness and connect to where you're operating from a place of abundance as opposed to a place of scarcity. And that changes everything, in my opinion.